Hello there. Sorry, I'm a loud speaker, so I will try to hold the microphone far enough away from my booming voice. My kids are always telling me that it's extremely embarrassing because everyone in the restaurant can hear me. So I'll try to keep it under control. I am so delighted to be here in Louisville tonight, first of all, because I am celebrating about 2 hours ago, I got a call from my publisher. The New York Times has debuted at number 7 on the hardcover list. And number 10 on the combined print and ebook list, which includes paperbacks as well. So that's some tough competition volume-wise. So it's very exciting to be there on that list. So thank you all for your support of this book. I'm so excited to be here in Louisville on this very special night because, as I was explaining earlier backstage, little known fact, I was the horse racing geek of Seattle, Washington as a 12-year-old. And I think that this is probably, being at the Brown Hotel is, a lifelong dream, and to be sitting there at the bar celebrating being on the hardcover bestseller list was, definitely one of the highlights probably in my life, right up there with, having kids and meeting my husband. So thank you all for giving me that wonderful moment in the perfect spot. And I'm really happy to be here with The Summer Wives, which is a book that really I've been sort of getting ready to write all my life, not quite all my life, but certainly since I moved to New England when I was just out of college. I actually moved to New York. My husband comes from a long-standing New England family. Now, I am a West Coaster. I grew up near Seattle, as I said. My father is British. My mother is Californian that worked for about 20 years or so, and then they divorced finally. But in the meantime, I had a very West Coast upbringing. And so when I moved in, I went to college in California. And when I moved east after college, moved to New York City, met my husband and his very New England family, I quickly realized that I had a lot to learn about this new culture. And luckily, I was an anthropology major in college. So I was well equipped with all the tools I needed to just, first of all, understand that I was in a different culture. The natives were not like my natives. And that I had to kind of feel my way along. So one of the first things I realized when I met my husband's family, and actually just New Englanders in general, is that, in Seattle and the West Coast and even into the Midwest, I don't know about you guys, we're a hugging culture. So you see somebody you give them a big hug. Do you hug in Louisville? Are you huggers? Okay, you're huggers too, so you understand this. Well, let me give you a piece of advice. When you are going to New England, do not go in for the hug, okay? Do not, even if this is your long-lost, sister separated from birth, do not hug her, okay? You go in for the air kiss. Maybe 2 if you know her really well. And otherwise you'll get the shrink back, they will hug their dogs readily, but children, adults, no hugs. It's a little creepy for them. So just hold back on the hugging. The other thing, it's a very formal culture. So I met my husband and I'm in my 20s, and I had been to college in California, very casual, laid-back atmosphere. So I meet this woman and I know her name is Caroline, so I call her Caroline. Instantly, I sensed that this was not the right thing to say. And from then on, I called her Mrs. Williams, which seemed to suit the situation much better. Now, I tell you, we love each other. She is like a second mother to me. You might even say she's more like a first mother to me. But she's really wonderful and lovely and warm and loving. But there are certain things you say and you don't say. And it was when my husband and I got engaged and we sat down and had, dinner with them to celebrate. And Caroline takes my hand and gives me an air kiss. And she says, "Finally now you can call me Caroline." So So finally, I was like, yay, what a milestone. So now she's been carrying, actually now she's Coco now that we have kids. So that was another thing I had to learn. The other thing I had to learn was just people will say one thing and mean another thing. And I know in the South you kind of understand that a little bit. Bless your hearts. But, for me it was, in the West, we tell it like it is. So, I went to the beach club for the first time with my mother-in-law, and this is a beach club that she and her family have been attending for the last 100 years or so. And so we're sitting out there on the boardwalk, and mind you, I'm 22 years old, so I'm a little bored just sitting on a boardwalk. Mind you, right now, there's nothing I would rather do than be sitting on a boardwalk sipping the rum Southside. But back then, I thought it was very boring. So I amused myself by kind of observing everybody going by. And what would happen is, people would go by and they would stop at our table. So, a Scooter in the pink polo shirt would walk by, and he would, stand next to the table and say hello to my mother-in-law, and they would have this lovely chat about, his son, Chip, at Princeton, and, lacrosse, and, Paine-Webber, and all this stuff. And I'd be watching this interchange and trying to remember everybody's names and details, and he would move away, and my mother-in-law would turn to me and say, "I never liked him." And I thought, really, that's very interesting, because I thought you knew each other really well. But what I didn't understand then, what luckily I have come to understand now, is that this is the club, right? This is the club. And, her family's been going there for 100 years, and his family has been going there 100 years. And guess what? They want to keep it that way. They want to make sure that, Chip doesn't get blackballed at the club when he wants to join as an adult, and my mother-in-law's kids can join when they want to, and that it all just perpetuates. And isn't that really what cultures are about? It's about, yes, you try to sort of find your like-minded people, right? But you also have to find a way to get along with the people that you don't like so well, that are still in your group. Remember, go back to hunter-gatherer days. You might not like everybody in the cave, but you're in the cave, right? There's nothing you can do about that. So either that or go out and try and join another cave that's very, very scary. So we're all in this together, these clubs, these cultures. And there is this constant tension, because you've got to preserve what is good and wonderful, all these traditions you've got, these things that you treasure and hold dear. And yet, if you never change, if you never innovate, you never allow in any new blood, you're going to, after a while, grow a shell, aren't you? You're going to harden, you're going to ossify, and you're not going to survive. So there's this tension in small cultures and large cultures, in epics, between the need to conserve and the need to innovate. And, when I started out, in college, and I was fascinated with sort of 19th century fiction, British fiction, my father's British, so I'd had that introduction as a child. And I took a wonderful course on turn-of-the-century Europe. And, contrary to our view that we had this long, lovely, golden Edwardian summer, and then the First World War came, that's really not quite true, is it? We had Picasso, we had Richard Strauss, we had all this innovation in music and in art and in literature. We had innovations in science and technology. We had Einstein come and overturn this, this static Newtonian universe in which everything was fixed and immutable. And all of a sudden, we have relativism. All of a sudden, we have this notion that things aren't fixed, that they all are in relation to your perception of them. This is kind of a big idea, and it really kind of informs all of modernism, doesn't it? So we have these innovations in science, in technology, in politics, social change, economic change. All of this is bubbling up in that first decade of the 20th century. And then what comes along? the First World War, which is this tremendous catastrophe for Western civilization. And not only do you have the landscape of Europe blown apart in those years, you have the last shreds of the 19th century Romanticism blown apart as well on those muddy fields. You have the idealism of the 19th century replaced by irony, by cynicism. You have the 20s come along when everything that you had believed in before has been toppled and crumbled. The institutions in which you had faith, government and family and God himself, are suddenly reduced to being, mere shells. So you go and you look for something else. You look for new meaning. You live for the moment. You have fun. And you've got the car. Women have the vote. You have booze. Oh, wait a minute. No, you don't have booze. This is the 1920s. But you find it anyway. In fact, more people are drinking than ever before. When I did my novels about the 1920s, I had a whole long talk about the 20s. That was a lot of fun for everybody. Not almost as much fun as the 1920s themselves. So we have this decade of sort of hedonism and this sort of desperate search for meaning. Meaning, becoming just sort of fun, living for the moment, living for yourself. And then comes the 1930s, and we have depression, we have this party and the punch bowl is taken away. The 30s becomes this decade of want, of people having not even enough to eat. And guess what? We also have the template for the mass murder that came later. Stalin in the 1930s starving millions of his own people, the people in the Ukraine, the famine in the Ukraine. So you could argue that Hitler is only just taking a page from Stalin's playbook, taking it one step further when it comes to the Holocaust. So we have this age of mass murder, and then we have the war, we have the Second World War, this incredibly bloody conflict that involves all corners of the globe. And finally, we win. We put this behind us. We come to terms with our loss, and we move into the 1950s. And if the previous 3 decades have been all about the forces of innovation and change and cataclysm, the 1950s is the moment when everybody said, stop, just stop, I can't take this anymore. We've got to go back to the way things were. So in the 1950s, we have that instinct to preserve, to go back to the institutions and the ideals we once held dear. And to many people, it was a great relief. To people like my grandmother, it was death. My grandmother had been born, she was, as I said, British, my father's family. She was actually born in Kobe, Japan, to the sort of, the British colonial elite there. She used to tell me stories about the Tokyo earthquake of 1924. When she was a young woman, she moved to Calcutta, India, and that was where she met my grandfather, who, by the way, had had his own, story. He had grown up in St. Petersburg, Russia, had had to flee across Scandinavia during the Bolshevik Revolution, ended up in England with, the family there, trained as an engineer, and worked all over the world on these massive sort of British colonial infrastructure projects. So they met in Calcutta in the 1930s, and throughout the next decade or so, they were, belonged to all these clubs, and oh my gosh, the photographs of the New Year's Eve ball, with all the red lipstick, and they would go trekking in the Himalayas, and they would go on safari, and they actually did not experience the Second World War that much. And then they went back to England in 1948 with their 2 small children. And they just sort of, it was like death for my grandmother. She said it was the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s. She said it was an amazing, wonderful time to be a woman. She said, and then the 50s came. And I still remember her British voice. She would say, and it's as if we fell asleep. She was so indignant. And But and I remember those words so well, and I felt so sympathetic for her. And yet, can't you understand why the people who had lived through the Blitz, who had lived through this depression, might have wanted to go back to the way things were? And so they did. In the 1950s, there was obviously, as we know, this return to tradition and this return to, the older values. And women, by and large, wanted to marry and raise their families in peace and quiet at last. And as my grandmother says, it wasn't until the 1960s came that we finally woke up again. And so that was her time. But I've always been fascinated by that notion of having this moment, these decades of change and churn and innovation, and then have a decade when everything sort of stopped and stood still. And maybe we needed that. And when I was thinking about writing a book set in the 1950s and looking around for a setting that would be a great way to tell that story, I immediately thought of this island in Long Island Sound called Fisher's Island. Now, how many of you have heard of Fisher's Island? A few of you have. Well, let me tell you, the Fisher's Islanders will be very upset to hear that, because unlike Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, those flashy places, Fisher's Island is a bit like Fight Club. The first rule about Fisher's Island, you don't talk about Fisher's Island, right? It's all about this very quiet environment where these wealthy families go to summer under the radar. In fact, most of the island is in private hands, and you can't even actually go that far up the main road before you hit the guard shack, and that's it. If you go on Realtor.com to try to find a house on Fisher's, you'll maybe turn up like one listing. Why? Because these houses are handed down generation after generation. It's the same families year after year, coming there to summer. But there's another population on Fisher's Island, and that is the year-round population. It's small, it's shrinking, because there used to be a very active fishing fleet on Fisher's that is no longer there. It's no longer as economically viable to go lobster fishing in Long Island Sound. But it was there, and they were largely the descendants of Southern European immigrants. Now, this was very interesting to me, because when I first heard about Fisher's, and it was very intriguing, this very secretive culture, these families that kept going back year after year. But one of the things that fascinated me as I learned more, and I was able to learn more because my husband's family has some connections there. Here's something interesting. The Episcopal Church on Fisher's Island, and Episcopal Church being sort of, the state religion of, the WASP elite, that was open only during the summer. The rest of the year, the minister, and I know this because that's my husband's family, was the minister there, tended his flock on the Upper East Side of Manhattan at St. James's Church, which of course is sort of the high society church on the Upper East Side. But the Catholic Church on Fisher's Island is open year-round. And if you're a novelist with an anthropology background, this sends little bells dingling in your head, because you think, oh my gosh, not only is there this economic divide, this divide of wealth and of status, there is also this ethnic and religious divide. And at what point, we human beings, we, of course, at our most basic tendency, cultural tendency, is to divide people into us versus them. And it is something that sometimes serves us well and sometimes creates some huge problems that we have in society. But it is an instinct that is very hard for us to quell. So if you're on an island with this major gulf between the summer families and the year-rounders, and yet you're on an island. So sometimes them is part of us, but sometimes them goes back to being them again. And it's very subtle, these moments when that happens. And what about people who are kind of in an ambiguous zone in between those two? Then things start to get a little interesting. So when I thought about writing about the 1950s and a society overall that is obsessed with preservation with returning to traditions that we had held and values we had held in the past, I thought, well, maybe Fisher's Island would be a great setting. However, the Fisher's Islanders are very protective and powerful and probably can lawyer up faster than I can. So I thought, well, I will create an island inspired by Fisher's Island. And any families belonging to any chemical dynasty, maybe we'll call them the Dumonts, for example. We'll just have to be very careful as we sort of go through, our geography and our society on my fictional Winthrop Island. So Winthrop Island took shape. And I decided to tell this story as a little bit of a story along the lines of my Schuyler family. Now, if you've read any of my books, who's read one of my books before already? Oh, not that many. You're all new. Well, I assure you, you do not have to have read any of my books to read this one. In fact, this is the first book I've written in a long time where there are no characters in it that you have ever met before. Usually I write in what's called, I learned the Marvel people have a word for this, it's called the shared universe. So, I don't know these Marvel, is it Spider-Man? Spider-Man exists in the same, universe as, one of the other guys. And, sorry. Oh, Wonder Woman, there we go. Wonder Woman's there too. So anyway, is she DC? I don't know my superheroes very well. But anyway, so it's all in the same universe, kind of the way Anthony Trollope used to do it in the 19th century. Anyone else a big Trollope fan? Yes, the Trollope fan. So the Pallisers, the Barchester Chronicles. So each book sort of stood by itself, but you would recognize characters that had popped up in other books. And I like to do that because I like to create this very rich fictional universe. But this book contains no characters you've already met. It does, however, contain a few Schuylers. They're not Schuylers that have appeared in any of my other books. In fact, I had to completely update my family tree on my website to show that Miranda, my main character in this book, comes from kind of a minor branch of the family. Miranda Schuyler's father is a scholar. And he is a teacher at an exclusive girls' academy in Virginia called Foxcroft Academy, which actually exists. My father-in-law's mother and sisters went there, so that's where I got all my Foxcroft lore that I put in the book. And so Miranda, her father is a teacher there, so she is able to attend Foxcroft sort of as a scholarship student. And then her father dies in the Second World War, which leaves a tremendous hole in Miranda's life. And not only that, as she goes through school, and they allow her to stay on, as she goes through there, she's really kind of not one of them, is she? I mean, she is, but she isn't. And then her mother marries. Finally, she remarries, and she marries the father of one of these wealthy Foxcroft girls. And suddenly, Miranda's life changes. And at the start of the book is when she has arrived for the first time on Winthrop Island. Her mother is about to marry Hugh Fisher, and she's about to get a new stepsister, Isabel. Now, Isabel, unlike Miranda, has been born to all this privilege. She's very comfortable in it, and she's quite happy to have a new sidekick in which to share her adventures on an island to her that is rather boring. If you're Isabel and you're kind of adventurous and you're going to the same island year after year after year after year and the same people year after year, and you do the same, you go to the club for dinner night after night after night. There's no restaurants on this island, by the way. There are no hotels. It's all the club and what they call domestic entertaining. So to Isabel, it's quite boring. She's very happy to have Miranda with her now because as the newlyweds go off on their honeymoon, the mice are kind of left to play. But Miranda, as much as she's sort of, a bit intoxicated by this new world, she's a little bit repelled by it as well. And in fact, she's drawn to a young man who lives nearby. He actually lives on the lighthouse that you can see from her new house on Winthrop Island. And Joseph, unlike Isabel, is in a very ambiguous position because here he is. He's the son of the lighthouse keeper. He helps his father out on the lobster boat in the summer, but then the rest of the year he is at Brown. He is actually going to college and getting an education, and so the idea is that he will soon be moving into a different class than the year-rounders he's grown up with. So he's in this kind of liminal territory, isn't he? He's not fully a year-rounder, and yet he's certainly not one of the summer families. And yet, unlike Miranda, he feels very comfortable in this position. He doesn't feel this sort of conflict. He doesn't feel like there's any discomfort in his position. And Miranda finds herself very drawn to this young man throughout the course of the summer. But there is one problem. He has a very intense personal relationship with Isabel. So you can see this triangle developing over the course of the summer. And you know, by the way, that this summer has ended in a terrible catastrophe as a result of this triangle. The reason you know this is because the story alternates between 1951 and 1969. Why? Because whatever it is that happened in 1951, it has banished Miranda from Winthrop Island for 18 years. And in 1969, she returns to the island, having left behind a terrible heartbreak, a failed marriage to an older man, and a film career, by the way. She's become an actress. So she comes to Winthrop to hide, because there's really no place on earth you can hide better than on Winthrop Island. And so she's come there to not be in the spotlight. But in doing so, she has to face up to what happened that last summer, to find out what really happened, and to hopefully find justice for this young man that she loved so much. So as we go back and forth, and all my books I structure very, very carefully, but this one in particular, because there's actually a third narrative, a smaller narrative, but very important, that takes place in the 1930s, that also alternates within the other two. And that is a story of a young woman named Bianca, who is also part of the year-round population. She is an orphan. She's the niece of some of the Portuguese immigrants that have come there to the island. And Bianca has her own story of falling in love with the wrong guy from the wrong side of that social divide. So that story, those three narratives, take place over the 3 months of the year. So in June, we visit the 1930s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, and we see the same patterns happening year after year. In July, the same thing. 1930s, 1950s, 1960s. We see the parallels in what's going on. And then August, the same 3 decades as the summer winds to its end, and we need to bring all these stories, all these relationships to an end before the end of summer. So that's all I am actually going to say right now about the book, because I can't, if I say any more, I'll be giving away spoilers, and I don't want to do that. So now I'm going to open it up to your questions. I'm happy to answer anything, really, whether it's about my previous books or about the Summer Wives, about the history of the culture behind it. If all of my books taken together really just sort of chart the course of this cultural change that takes place in Western civilization during that first half of the 20th century, and I'm always passionately eager to talk about any aspect of that might interest you. So please fire away. And if you can, I think there's a microphone. I had to borrow one of the microphones because I wander, and this is a fixed microphone here. But I can certainly, if you can't get to a microphone, I'm happy to repeat your question so everyone can hear it. Yes, first question. Oh, great, like me, we're sisters.
What are you doing next?
Great question. Well, next, it's always interesting when I'm going on tour because I bring out a book every summer. So I've always got the book that I am presenting, which I am so excited and passionate about. But there's also the book that I have just finished and turned in that will be out next summer. So that's in my head. There's also the book that I am getting ready to sit down and start writing once my kids are back in school at the beginning of September. And actually this summer I have 4 books in my head because I don't know who knows this, you should know this by now, but I also have written a collaborative novel with 2 of my very dear writing friends. Yeah, so we have some readers there. So Karen White, who writes wonderful Southern fiction, I see some nods in there, I hope you're all Karen White readers. She writes Southern fiction, and our friend Lauren Willig, who also writes in this sort of multiple narrative format that Karen and I love, and her books tend to be focused on the British Isles. Well, we're very dear friends, and at one point a few years ago at a writing conference, maybe after having a little too much wine, we thought it'd be really fun if we wrote a book together. Why? Because then we could go on book tour together, which is, believe me, a lot more fun than sitting at the bar, the hotel bar, celebrating being on the New York Times list all by yourself with nobody except your phone and your connection to the outside world. So we thought this would be a great idea, especially, you know, with the publisher paying for it. So we sat down and we did this. We wrote a book called The Forgotten Room, which takes place in the 1890s. In the 1920s and the 1940s, all inside this single building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, 3 different generations of women. And it's all sort of tied together by a central mystery that happened in a room in that house. So that book came out in January of 2016. Our publisher was like, well, we love you guys. We want to keep you happy, so we'll put out your little book. And of course, it immediately hit the New York Times list. And so they were like, whoa, actually, this was a really good idea. And we said, yes, of course, it's a very good idea. So in fact, we'd love to write another one. So we went, and the very last day of that book tour, we outlined our next book, which will be out in September, September 4th. It's called The Glass Ocean. It is set on the final voyage of RMS Lusitania. And 2 of the perspectives take place on board the ship, and then there is one narrative that takes place 100 years later as a researcher tries to uncover what happened to her ancestor on that fatal voyage. So we're very excited about this book. September 4th, we will be on a wonderful book tour. If you love book talks, you might want to actually road trip. Take a look at our schedule and road trip to this one, because it is really a lot of fun. We have tremendous chemistry. We adore each other. We love each other's writing, and it's just really kind of, we're like a 3-person comedy routine up there because we're having so much fun, and no wine at all. Yes.
I read the book and I loved it.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm wondering, would you write a sequel? I'd like to find out what happened to Joseph and Miranda.
Well, I don't tend to write sequels per se, because all my books are kind of connected. So you get your sort of epilogues by reading other books. And I did love writing The Summer Wives so much. I felt like I was in such a groove. I think being an outsider in this East Coast culture has made me very sensitive to just all the subtleties around a position like someone like Miranda, feels in the society that she's in. So I kind of really felt like I hit a groove. So look, I'm not going to say sequel, but I certainly am open to and have some ideas for, say, follow-on books that maybe take place in Winthrop, and then perhaps we might see some of these characters again in a book like that. But I'm not saying anything for sure because I don't want anyone to hold my feet to the fire. But thank you so much. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Your check is in the mail. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. I often find some of my readers are, they sort of they read it quickly the first time because they can't stop turning the pages, and then they're like, okay, I'll allow myself to read this quickly, and then I'll go back and try to just catch everything, because I do put a lot in there. You know, I grew up, we did not have a ton of money growing up. My father is a civil engineer like his father. My mother was a homemaker. My clothes came from their Sears catalog. But the pennies that they scraped together went toward things like our family summer vacation, which was a week watching Shakespeare plays at the Ashland Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, Oregon, which is a fantastic site. In 1936, this man named Angus Bomer had the really clever idea of building a replica Elizabethan theater in the middle of sort of the wastelands of southern Oregon, and people came, and now it's one of the sort of the great venues for Shakespeare. And we went there. I remember my first year, I was 5 years old, and we saw Taming of the Shrew and The Tempest. Interestingly, The Tempest, because that does figure in this book, Miranda being the main character, and this whole idea of kind of the magical properties of islands, and that sort of figures in the book. But, you know, so we had that. I did not get to see Richard III at age 5. I was considered too young for that. But at age 7, you know, we also had season tickets to the Seattle Opera, and they took me to Don Giovanni, which, I mean, is so incredibly inappropriate for a 7-year-old if you think about it. I mean, we're talking about Don Juan here, right? And he's sleeping around with all these women. At the end of the opera, you know, the statue of the Commendatore comes to life and drags him down to hell. I was 7, people. Okay, so I'm still in therapy over this, but no, but we did have, so I was exposed at a very young age to storytelling that takes place in scenes, where everything is conveyed through dialogue and action. So that is how I convey all the ideas in my books, all this sort of, this discussion of culture and of social norms. It's all buried in the text of the book. So, yes, there's a fun story there, but if I hear the words sizzling beach read one more time, I'm going to scream, because I think there's actually a fair amount of steak underneath that sizzle, and I certainly hope that you will give it a close read once you're done. Sometimes I feel a bit like Tannhäuser, being told he has to to go to the Pope and beg for forgiveness for writing this song that celebrates carnal love. We have this idea that anything that includes some sex must therefore just be very naughty and not substantive. But to me, here I'm going way off your question here. But I don't see any other arms raised, so I'm just going to keep going. But, I just feel like it's such an intensely personal and human experience that it does give us such insight into people's character and what is going on in a relationship between two people. So that is why there is sex in my books. Yes, it's good for you. Yes, it's very good for you. We do have a question over there, yes.
Okay, speaking of magic and sex.
All good things, and magical sex, yes?
Well, that's up to you. Your first book had a magical kind of element.
There was a magical element.
That I don't think we've seen since. So I'm wondering if you thought you might do that again in the future, but also, how do you now see Beatriz, the debut author?
That's a very interesting question. In fact, little known fact, I do have a couple of books that explore that a little further. I wrote under a pen name, Juliana Gray. This was my agent's idea, because when we first, when my publisher first bought Overseas, my first book, there was actually about 2.5 years that elapsed between them buying the book and the book actually coming out in print. So my agent thought it'd be a great idea if I wrote some books under a pen name. And I am a bit of a workhorse, and I'm not happy unless I'm writing something. So I said, yes, absolutely. And I did. And the first 6 books were actually works of historical romance. Yes. So, the sex in this is pretty tame, believe me, by comparison. Yes, Juliana Gray. But then by the time I had written 6 of them, I didn't feel like I really needed to write anymore. The thing, and I loved writing them, but there are certain conventions that you have to follow, and the ideas that I was having just sort of didn't fit into those conventions. So I said, well, and they wanted me to keep writing them, and I said, well, what if we write historical mystery instead? So We did. So there's 2 books, A Most Extraordinary Pursuit and A Strange Scottish Shore. And if you read those, you will discover there is, in fact, a link to overseas, a link that I intend to develop further if and when the series continues. So that is there. But it's interesting how, yes, you're quite right that my very first book is quite different from the books that followed. Overseas was not actually the book that I sort of expected to write. I first wrote it, I had this kind of crazy idea in the middle of a writing conference, and I thought, oh, that's just silly. That's not what I ever planned to write. But I couldn't get the idea out of my head. So I kept at it, and eventually I sat down and wrote the book, and that, lo and behold, was my first manuscript that was accepted for publication. So, it's very dear to my heart, but when I sort of sat down to write my next book, I had a different idea, and I had this idea about the hurricane of 1938 and New England, and a lot of these ideas that I'm continuing to explore now, which is this notion of cultural change, and particularly the interior lives of women during this period of cultural change. And that was 100 Summers, and I wrote that thinking, wow, I feel like this is my lane. This is really all the stories that I have to tell sort of, are kind of at this point, inside that world, inside that notion of just this vast sweep of the first half of the 20th century and how it affected us in our daily lives, our interior lives, particularly as women. I think that's a story that doesn't get told that much. We focus so much on historical events and not on the culture and how it affected people living their daily lives. So, yes.
There seems to be few areas of literature which, let's say, have equal amounts of men and women writers, men and women fans. Mm-hmm. And yeah, history is one, but that sometimes get into things like fantasy and stuff. Men mm-hmm. seem to like thrillers and comedies. I don't know women who write that kind of thing. I was wondering if you could give me some titles of books that have, let's say, a fairly even amount of men and women fans. And perhaps maybe in a sense if you were to combine the historical romance with, let's say, a thriller or comedy, maybe that might be a balance. But then again, I don't know this whole field. I'm just wondering if maybe you might recommend some novels that you have read or whatever in which there is a balance of men and women fans and men and women writers.
That's a very interesting question. It is certainly true that, by and large, and I'm speaking in very general terms, that generally speaking, women are much more likely to pick up a book written by a man than men are likely to pick up a book written by a woman. Why? Because the male experience is seen as universal, the female experience is seen as being particular only to women. And that is so, luckily, women have the most readers of fiction. So, we are able to reach a wide audience, not because the New York Times is reviewing us, and not because any of the major newspapers and publications tend to review women's commercial fiction, but because we share the books with each other. We go out and buy the books, we browse the bookstore. And so that is how women are able to reach a wider audience, and now luckily through blogs as well. So, we've sort of managed to, but I can just tell you right now, a friend of mine, Christina Alger, wrote a thriller called The Banker's Wife. And she's kind of one of the few women in that space, and I'm very interested to see whether men, because it's a thriller, will pick it up even though it's written by a woman. I think in general, it is very difficult for a woman to gain access to a male audience at all. It's just very, very difficult, and it certainly depends on the subject matter. I do have a few male readers, certainly a very loyal male readership, and they're not all in prison either, with nothing else to read. They are, and in fact, my father-in-law quite enjoys my books. My father does, and often they see a lot of things in them that women don't see, which is terrific. It's always neat to get that perspective. So I think it's actually more challenging on the side of female authors to try and reach a male audience, and I'm not sure how it's done. And I think, the problem is that, I think that women, if you have a female protagonist, I think, you're just going to have a much more difficult task reaching a male readership. And so how do we solve that problem? I'm not sure. Does it mean that more women have to be branching out and writing things that where you have a male protagonist, where you have, or do we encourage more men? I don't know if you can do that, to just encourage more men to read works written by women. In this Me Too era, where we're trying to say, look, women's stories are important and we're trying to get them heard, maybe that will help as well. But I don't think it's necessarily a question of genre and, whether if you put thriller elements into a historical romance, men are going to pick it up. It's a very fine line. A lot of it comes down to, major reviewers taking a more sort of wider and more diverse view of fiction. I mean, they will review thrillers and crime fiction. Generally speaking, they will not review, women's commercial fiction.
I have a suggestion. Of course, it's kind of hard to put it into effect, but I think if a man and a woman would write a novel together, it would be interesting in the sense that you get both sides of the opinion. The only thing is, how can you write a romance, a man and woman writing together, without, in a sense, during the course of writing the book, having some type of relationship? And I'm wondering if anybody's ever done that.
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe that's what you do. I think a lot of women have gotten around it by just using their initials. I mean, J.K. Rowling, for example, that's what she did. Was she specifically wrote her book, presented herself as an author with just the initials because, look, her book, the primary two characters are boys, and there's Hermione, but the central friendship really starts out between Harry and Ron, and so by making sure that she had an androgynous author name, certainly when you're first starting out, when people don't know anything about the book or just picking it up, you're just much more likely to get those boy readers as well as the girl readers. It's a really tough question, and I'm certainly not pointing fingers at all. I mean, I think it's just human beings are who they are, and it's on me to create something that is interesting for men to read as well. And maybe my publisher, but the thing is, of course, my publisher knows that it has a better chance of appealing to women, so there's going to be a woman on the cover. So there's always going to be this. My friend Christine Alger, who wrote The Banker's Wife, there was just this long sort of, well, should we have the word wife in there? Are men going to pick it up if the word wife is in there? And what is the cover going to look like? Do we have a woman on the cover at all, or do we just make it very thriller-like? So these are all interesting, questions, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how it develops. I don't think there's like a magic formula to try and solve the problem, though. I think we just, it's just on us as writers to write books that appeal to, to both audiences. Yes.
Most of the authors I know are avid readers.
Yes.
So tell me some of the books that have been in your reading list this summer.
Well, I have to say, summer is my reading time because I have 4 children. And during the year, it gets a little busy between that and the writing. And most of my reading tends to be either research on the book that I am currently writing, or else review copies that I am sent, particularly in sort of the winter and early spring. Books will be out that summer, and I'm supposed to read them and provide some sort of quote for the cover and so on. So very little of my reading during the year is anything by choice. It's not something that I'm like, oh, I can't wait to read this, and I pick it up. And the summer is my time to sort of binge read. So last summer, I had read prep when that came out, but I hadn't read any of Curtis Sittenfeld's other books, and I had a wonderful time going through that. And it's funny, I found so many parallels because, and actually she also went to Stanford, which was kind of neat, and because Stanford tends to be fairly techy. I graduated from the class of '94, and everybody else just went out and started an internet company and became a billionaire, and I'm the underachiever in the group, but so it's kind of fun to find another Stanford author. And she writes contemporary fiction, but she too, often there's this sense of this outsider navigating through a very complicated and arcane East Coast culture in her books. So I found a great parallel there, and I really had a wonderful time going through her books. The historical fiction, I don't actually read a lot of historical fiction for the simple reason that, number one, I want to make sure that my voice stays my voice. Number two, historical fiction is not actually that helpful if you're a writer of historical fiction, because if you're looking for voice, you have to go to primary sources. You have to go, and to me, voice is so important. Having an authentic period voice, whether my characters are in the 1920s or the 1950s or the 1910s, each decade has its own voice. Each people have their own voices. So I'm watching old movies, and I'm reading books that were written in that time, and I'm reading memoirs and diaries and letters, because capturing that voice is so important, and capturing the texture of daily life. I've read 3 works of historical fiction lately where they have people flying across the Atlantic in the late 1930s on passenger planes, and I think those are one of those things that it just doesn't occur to you doesn't happen unless you're just completely, it's one of the things that you don't know. You just think, well, they were flying, so they might, and you don't stop to question that. You have to stop and question every last detail. You can't assume that it was so because you think it was so, or you read it in someone else's work of historical fiction. But historical fiction that I do love is above and beyond everything else is Patrick O'Brian, whose novel, if you want, actually, here is a writer who had a tremendous female readership as well as male readership. He was writing books that were set in the Napoleonic era in the British Navy. It's about a British Navy captain, Royal Navy captain, and his ship's surgeon. One of the books was made into a movie, Master and Commander, with Russell Crowe, and his books are so amazing, not just because they've got this wonderful, these page-turning plots and these characters who are so real, so full of flaws, and yet so well characterized, again, not through description, but by action and dialogue, and presenting them as people, as characters, not sort of describing who they are. He does a tremendous job of that, and he's got this wonderful voice that is both literary and accessible and erudite and informed, and yet still not arcane. He's really tremendous. I go back to his books. I binge read them actually when I was in college, and every time I had another baby, those long nights feeding the baby and so on, I'd have a book in one hand and the baby in the other, and it's just seen me through. And so that is what I aspire to as a writer of historical fiction, is creating that kind of work. So I highly recommend that. If you want something that was more recently written, Sally Koslow's book, Another Side of Paradise, was a book that I read over the winter as a review copy. That's really wonderful. It's the story of F. Scott Fitzgerald's final love affair with a Hollywood gossip columnist, Sheila Graham. I myself, it is never, at this point, I never would contemplate writing a book where my main point of view character is a real historical figure, but Sally pulls it off brilliantly, and I really enjoyed that. Susie Crandall's new book, The Myth of Perpetual Summer, is also terrific. Really enjoyed reading that one. So those are just a few books that I've read recently that I really enjoyed. Yes? My writing process. It is continuous. I am a flow writer. I believe so strongly in the flow of writing. So that means that if you sit down to write every single morning, as soon as my kids are off on the school bus, I will sit down. with my laptop, and I will make myself write. And if I am lucky, I will get into that zone where the best writing is done. And it doesn't even, you actually write very quickly in that zone because it's your best self. It is your best writer self that is getting there on the page. And that is what I aim for every day, is to push myself as hard as I can to get into that zone, because it is work. You don't just sit there and wait for the muse to come. You go out there and you drag it from inside you and bring it, out onto the page. And that is what you have to do every single day, and that is what I do. I am not sort of a quick first drafter and then go back and do massive revisions. I tend to write carefully as I go along, and then hopefully not have too much to revise. But I also believe that it's better to have a bad page up than no page at all. So I'll just keep writing until the book that I just turned in, that will be out next summer. Actually, I can give you a little preview of that because it is partly set, and this is the reason why it gave me so much trouble, in the Bahamas in the 1940s. And the reason I did that, can anyone tell me who was governor of the Bahamas in the 1940s? That was the Duke of Windsor and his wife. Did anyone watch The Crown? So they were in the Bahamas during the Second World War. Why? It was a bit of an exile. Winston Churchill needed them to go somewhere where they wouldn't be sort of giving interviews with newspapers that sounded sort of slightly defeatist and pro-Nazi, for one thing. And also, they had this sort of awkward and technically treasonous habit of trying to squirrel their money away offshore just in case their side lost, which was technically treason, but so anyway, so they sent him to the Bahamas, where he was actually a very good governor. He actually did a good job in a lot of ways, but certainly did nothing to advance the problem of the separation of races there, which was a huge problem in the Bahamas. Not so violent a problem as elsewhere, but certainly, he never allowed either someone of African descent or mixed race to go through the front door of the governor's mansion while he was there. Might have had something to do with the fact that Wallace, of course, grew up in Maryland at a time when, the color line was very strictly observed. So he was not a revolutionary governor, but he did a pretty good job. He thought he was auditioning for a bigger role, but unfortunately that never came, and the rest of their lives, were spent in increasing bitterness and nastiness. They were not the nicest people in the world. But this, because I was dealing with very specific historical events, a very specific historical place against the backdrop of the Second World War, and then dealing with these two people who are iconic and well-known, and you want to get it right, I actually found that it was pretty challenging for me to write, because you just have to pay attention to every detail. You can't make anything up. You have to make sure that everything that's on the page is as accurate as you can possibly make it. You're not creating a fictional island. You're dealing with an actual real island called the Bahamas that many people have visited. So that sort of research was, it did sort of get me out of my writing flow quite a bit. But we got there. I turned in the manuscripts 2 weeks before The Summer Wives came out, so I'm not with my laptop in my hotel room after every event trying to finish this thing. Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you all for coming.
This has been a Metro TV production.